Hello. In this second edition of Peach Orchard Publishing's What They Saw, we'll be looking at Corbett's Charge, otherwise known as the Battle of Westminster, June 29, 1863. Corbett's Charge was a small affair preceding the Battle of Gettysburg. It can be argued that Corbett and his little band of the 1st Delaware Cavalry delayed Jeb Stuart and his cavalry long enough to make an impact on the outcome of the Battle of Gettysburg that followed. Major General James H. Wilson, United States Volunteers, wrote the account Captain Charles Corbett's Charge at Westminster, an episode of the Gettysburg Campaign. It was published in 1913 by the Historical Society of Delaware. I'll be using the first-person excerpts and records contained in General Wilson's book. This video is not intended to give a holistic view of Corbett's Charge, nor the much larger and drastic implications it had on the Battle of Gettysburg. It is told only through those who saw it. I make no efforts to refute any of the accounts nor correct any information. The video locations are sometimes approximations. Here are the accounts captured by General Wilson, as shown on the ground on which the participants stood and fought and died. From Captain Charles Corbett's Charge at Westminster. Westminster at that time was a small country town in Maryland near the line between Maryland and Pennsylvania at the western end of the Western Maryland, then serving as a branch to the Northern Central Railway. This branch projected into the quadrilateral nearly halfway to Gettysburg. Westminster at its outer end was connected by good roads with both Washington and Baltimore, and these with the branch railroad caused it to be made a field depot of supplies or a secondary base for the Army of the Potomac. It lies nearly 45 miles due north of Washington, about 25 miles northwest of Baltimore, and something like 30 miles from Gettysburg, all as the crow flies. If 15% be added to these figures for road curvatures, it will give you a close approximation to the actual distances. After Stuart with his 3 brigades crossed the Potomac, his route lay through Rockville, Brookville, Cookville, Hood's Mill, and Warfield to Westminster. On the way, he captured a few wagon trains and their guards, which served more to embarrass and delay him than to give him any substantial advantage. He skirmished at Rockville with Colonel Lowell's 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry, covering Washington, but none of these minor operations did any material injury to Meade's army or caused it the slightest delay, and but little anxiety. Westminster, however, the nearest railway terminus to his general line of march, and as it had a direct railway connection with Baltimore and a roundabout connection with Washington, it was of sufficient importance to cause Schenck to put it under guardianship of the Delaware Cavalry, and Meade to direct the 6th Corps not only to march through it, but to take it under temporary charge. As Buford's cavalry division was to cover Meade's advance, while Gregg's and Kirkpatrick's were marching parallel with and covering his right or eastern flank, it's evident that Stuart's routes lay through dangerous country, but there's nothing in his report to show that he had any adequate appreciation of the perils that beset him. From all accounts, especially his own, it's evident that the most he had in mind was to pass through Westminster on his way northward march to Hanover, York, and Carlisle, and possibly to Harrisburg in search of Lee's army, from which he had been separated for nearly a week. It is entirely clear that neither Stuart knew where Lee was, nor Lee where Stuart was. It's just as clear that both Meade's infantry and cavalry were between Lee and his cavalry, and that neither Lee nor Stuart knew the exact movements or plans of the other. It was under these conditions that Stuart's advance marching northward on the Washington-Westminster Road reached the vicinity of Westminster June 29th between 4 and 5 p.m. Fortunately, Major Knight, with 1 troop and a half, or 95 men as he states it, had reached the town from Baltimore on the 28th at 11 a.m., and after sending out scouts on all the roads, without discovery of any trace of the enemy, went into camp in the suburbs, on the road to Gettysburg about 30 miles away. That evening at 9 o'clock it was reported that the enemy had made his appearance on the outpost, but it turned out to be a false alarm. On the 29th, the pickets still reporting all quiet at the outpost, Knight gave orders to the squadron commander to have his barefoot horses reshod. Meanwhile, he himself, it is said, went to the local tavern where he was refreshing himself, when at 3:30 a citizen came in and reported the enemy as approaching in force on the Washington Road, the pickets having been captured. This news came as a surprise, it can be well understood, was followed by a few minutes of excitement, but not much uncertainty. The gallant Corbett, with the true instincts of a soldier, sounded "to horse" without a moment's delay, and followed this in turn by the formation of his little squadron, reduced by outposts to about 70 men, every one whom promptly found his proper place in the ranks. Taking the main street instantly in the direction of the alarm, Corbett, passing the tavern en route, paused only long enough to report the presence of his command and ask for orders. These came promptly enough from Major Knight to move at once against the enemy, but for reason that the Major himself had in earlier days been enrolled in the Confederate service, it is said he was afraid of being captured, and thereupon failed to put in his appearance or take the command that his rank and responsibility made obligatory upon him. Corbett, however, like the true soldier his ancestry and breeding made him, proved equal to the occasion. Taking the trot to the front, he and his gallant but untried followers soon found themselves in sight of hostile forces coming towards the town, and careless of whether it was a mere detachment or Stuart's whole division, of whose actual presence he was still entirely ignorant, he shouted, "Draw sabers!" and dashing to the front sounded the charge, throwing himself and his gallant followers furiously head-on against the astonished enemy. The daring and the shock of this movement were not only surprising, but overwhelming to the enemy. It necessarily overthrew his head of column, which is said had already been massed at a turn of the road, and compelled it to recoil and to reform under cover of the oncoming reinforcements. Indeed, there was nothing else to do, but old and experienced cavalrymen such as Stuart, Vitsley, and Hampton found that this simple operation requiring but a few minutes. In the spirited melee which resulted, the enemy soon checked Corbett, and by pistol shot killed his horse while it was throwing up its head under the pressure of the rein, and thus fortunately cover its rider behind. Corbett necessarily went down with his charger, and was captured pistol in hand while standing astride his dead horse. His men put up the best fight they could, but were soon scattered, and about half of them were taken prisoners. The same fate overtook Lieutenant Churchman and his men who covered the rear, while the remnant of the fighting force, preceded by Major Knight, withdrew by the Baltimore road to Reisterstown. Churchman was also captured, but Knight and Loblol continued their retreat after the pursuit had ceased. Knight was the first to reach Schenk's headquarters at Baltimore. He was also the first and only officer to make an official report, and this report was dated June 30th. General Schenck forwarded it at once to Washington, where it duly found its way into the official records as published by the War Department years after. While this report mentions favorably Lieutenant D.W.C. Clark with an advance guard of 12 men from Company C and Lieutenant Reedy and some 7 or 8 men of the same company rather unfavorably, it leaves the details of the whole affair somewhat uncertain. It characterized Captain Corbett's conduct as gallant and masterly, and praises the men as fighting all the time with the greatest bravery and determination, contending hotly for every inch of ground. It praised Lieutenant Churchman and his company as protecting and covering the retreat in splendid style, losing all but 7 of his men and falling himself into the hands of the enemy. Finally, it mentions a small detachment of the 1st Connecticut Cavalry, which they came across at Reisterstown. Ordering it to assist Lieutenant Reedy in rallying the men of his own command, Knight proceeded into Baltimore, in pursuance of an order he claimed to have received on the way from the department commander. He gives his casualty and losses in the fight and retreat as 2 commissioned officers, Captain Charles Corbett and Lieutenant Caleb Churchman, the former of whom fell while gallantly charging the enemy, and is now a prisoner in their hands, and the latter was captured while covering the retreat of the main body. He also lost 1 wagon laden with hospital stores, camp and garrison equipment, and the regimental books and papers. How many men escaped capture he failed to tell, but judging from the somewhat uncertain strength of the command, it's likely that between 50 and 60 men escaped finally, while Corbett and the men taken with him were irregularly paroled and released by Stuart in person the next day near Hanover after an informal conference in which he cordially commended their gallantry and told them they ought to be fighting for the Confederacy rather than against it. In closing this report, Major Knight calls special attention to the bravery and intrepidity of the officers and men whose efficiency and determination of purpose has saved us from utter annihilation. This constitutes the whole story so far as the Union records give it, but how much of this rests upon Major Knight's personal observations, and how much of it on that of others remains in doubt, which cannot be fully determined at this late date. It's certain that neither Corbett, nor Churchman, Lowell, nor Clark made any written report, and although several of them were, as already stated, paroled and released the next day, their personal experiences and observations in the actions and afterwards rest almost entirely upon tradition, to which further reference will be made in the conclusion of this paper. Fortunately, Stuart submitted to Lee's Adjutant General, August 20th, 1863, a full report of all the operations of his cavalry division from June 16th to July 24th of that year, and while this report is somewhat vainglorious in tone, it gives many interesting details, referring, as he says, to his desire to acquaint the commanding general with the nature of the enemy's movement as well as to place with his column my cavalry force. He adds, The head of the column following a ridge road reached Westminster about 5 p.m. At this place, our advance was obstinately disputed for a short time by a squadron of the 1st Delaware Cavalry, but were not killed, were either captured or saved themselves by a precipitate fight. In this brief engagement, 2 officers of the 4th Virginia Cavalry, Lieutenant Pierce and Gibson and John W. Murray, were killed. Gallant and meritorious, they were noble sacrifices to the cause. The lady of the place begged to be allowed to superintend their interment, and in accordance with their wishes, the bodies of these young heroes were left in their charge. It should be noted that the original of this report contained an endorsement made by General Lee, directing that the preceding sentence should be omitted if the report should be published. It then proceeds as follows. The fugitives were pursued a long distance on the Baltimore road, and I afterwards heard created a great panic in that city, impressing upon the authorities with the belief that we were just at their heels. General Wilson goes on to explain some of the possible impacts of the battle. It should also be stated that Colonel Mosby, in his spirited work on Stuarts' cavalry in the Gettysburg Campaign, contends that Stuart made no mistakes. He scarcely mentions Westminster except as one of Meade's important sub-bases of supply. He does not allude to the affair at the place, but in a private letter to the writer, dated May 12, 1913, he claims without going into details that Corbett's charge at Westminster did not delay Stuart's column 1 minute, nor in any way change Stuart's plans of operations. All this, however, is effectively controverted by the simple fact that at daylight July 1st, Stuart had crossed the road which Early and his division 12 hours before had marched towards Gettysburg. It's evident that if Stuart had followed him instead of keeping on his way northward towards Carlisle, he could have easily rejoined Lee by 2 p.m. of that momentous day, and coming in upon the broken right flank of Meade's army, he might have assured a victory for Lee that evening. Having given all the light afforded by the official records on the effective charge of the Delaware Cavalry at Westminster, and its probable consequences, both direct and indirect, it is now in order to collate the newspaper references and traditions in regard to the affair and to point out so far as possible their relations to the established facts of the case. It's settled beyond a doubt that Corbett acted mainly on his own responsibility, with the greatest personal intrepidity, and that in the melee which followed, the little band of less than 100 officers and men who followed him behaved with extraordinary spirit till overwhelmed and captured or driven from the field by the leading troops of Stuart's column. That this conclusion was inevitable, and when the relative numbers engaged are considered, can be admitted without the slightest reflection on the officers and men of the Union side, and it is not strange that no one of the time foresaw the great consequences which might follow such an unexpected and relatively insignificant affair. Adjutant William W. Wlode Bell, under date of June 27, 1913, in a reply to a letter of inquiry from the writer, enclosed a clipping from the New York Sun, and also a letter dated August 14, 1912, from O.V. Anderson, formerly 1st Sergeant of Company K, 4th Virginia Cavalry. The letter writes that he and several of his comrades had recently spent the night together, discussing their former campaigns, and with the aid of several letters from former companions and from the clerk of the court at Westminster, agreed substantially as follows. Our advance guard on the Baltimore Pike got to Westminster about 4 p.m. and became engaged with your command at once. Our company led the charge into Westminster, supported by the balance of the 4th Virginia. A regiment was dismounted to the right of the road and one to the left, but we had broken your command before these dismounted men got into the engagement, which took place from 5 to 6 p.m. and lasted only a few minutes, but they were hot one. Your command fought like Turks, killing a goodly number of our best men, but strange to say, our company which was in front lost none. Companies C and D, which came to our release, lost several good officers and some men. After the fight, they halted to feed their horses and draw rations, and then started on a night march towards Carlisle. Commenting on this letter, Captain Wlode Bell says, My recollection as to the time of the fight occurred does not agree with Mr. Anderson's. I should say it occurred between 1 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The troops were engaged were the advance of Stuart's cavalry, who were charging down the main street of Westminster, which at that time was a continuation of the Baltimore Pike. How many there were I have no means of knowing, but there were several platoons of them, who as our boys with Captain Corbett in command came charging down upon them, turned tail and ran as fast as they could to the main body of the Confederate troops. Coming up the Washington Road, which was at right angles with the Baltimore Pike, our troops, which had been sent out as a scouting party, consisted of Company C under Captain Corbett and part of Company D under Lieutenant Churchman. They were under the battalion commander, Major Knight, but as he was taken sick at the hotel the day of the fight, the actual command devolved upon Corbett, who was then the ranking captain, and I was just behind Captain Corbett when his horse, a fine black charger, was killed under him by a shot through the head, undoubtedly saving his life as the shot would have otherwise hit him in the breast. Our boys were crowded out of the Washington Pike by an overwhelming force, some escaping and some taken prisoner, among whom were Captain Corbett and Lieutenant Churchman. I was forced into a barnyard at the intersection of Baltimore and Washington Pikes, and by running and jumping, my horse being part thoroughbred, I escaped down the Baltimore Pike and finally reached Reisterstown, from which station I was sent to Baltimore that night with a report of the engagement to General Schneck. On the death of Captain Corbett, which occurred at his country place, Brookfield, December 29, 1887, a local correspondent sent, December 31st, a letter to the New York Sun from which the following extracts are taken. The late Captain Charles Corbett was buried at Odessa this afternoon. He was a man who perhaps changed the results of the Battle of Gettysburg by delaying Jeb Stuart's cavalry 24 hours at Westminster, Maryland, thus preventing him to get to Lee in time to be of service. The foregoing statement, it should be observed, is not directly supported by the official reports, hitherto referring to, but is a reasonable inference, more or less, certainly supported by the facts, as contained herein. The letter continues. Charles Corbett, in June 1863, was only 25 years of age. He was a captain of Company C, which was, at first, employed to guard the telegraph line through his peninsula. Their duty was to keep open communication by wire between Fort Monroe and the north, and, as yet, they had never smelt gunpowder. On June 28th, Corbett's company and part of Company D, in charge of Lieutenant Caleb Churchman, were ordered to Westminster about 30 miles southwest of Gettysburg as an advance guard of observation. There were 95 men and 7 officers in the little party, commanded by Major Napoleon B. Knight. Small squads were sent to look for the enemy, who were then marching into Pennsylvania. They found nothing, and Knight made himself at home at the Westminster Hotel, leaving Captain Corbett in command of the camp. The night of the 28th and the forenoon of the 29th were passed in quiet. In the afternoon, at about 3:30, while about 30 of the horses were being shod at a smith nearby, word came that the rebels had appeared. Adjutant Loblol, now vice president of the Loblol Car Wheel Company, was at the hotel. At the first alarm, he mounted and started for the camp a quarter-mile away, and as he did so, he met Corbett and 60 men coming down the road on a fast gallop. They stopped at the hotel for orders, but Major Knight was too sick to issue any. The Delaware boys were on the Baltimore Road and along the Washington Road, at right angles crossing it. In a depression in the ground came Stuart's cavalry. As they rode down the Baltimore Road and turned north, they saw the Delaware cavalry dashing towards them down the hill. Quickly turning their horses, they retreated up Washington Road. As line after line turned in the road, and either side of which was a stout fence, they became blocked. The rebel retreat was thus stopped, and, at this instant, the 60 Delaware boys dashed with sabers drawn madly into the mass of men and horses. The rebels were cornered and decided to make a fight, supposing the whole force of Union cavalry had attacked them. The 4th Virginia Cavalry was ahead, said to have been 250 strong, and they dashed towards the Delaware boys with a wild shout. Corbett, who was nearly 6 feet in height, rose in his saddle with uplifted saber and yelled, "Come on, boys, close up!" As he did so, he reined his horse's head high in the air, just in time for the animal to receive a ball between the eyes, intended for the master's breast. The charger sank down dead, and before his men could close around him, the rebels were upon him. Then followed a desperate hand-to-hand struggle with sabers and pistols. The rebel thousands came steadily over the hill, and by sheer force of numbers pressed the handful of Delawareans back inch by inch. The road was about 80 feet wide, and 60 Delawareans were jammed in. Stuart rapidly deployed his men around town and unlimbered his artillery so as to command the scene of the contest. In short time, however, the attacking party was surrounded and nearly all of them captured. A few got away, among them Adjutant Loblol, who had been fighting behind Corbett. Sergeant Clark not only escaped, but captured a fine black horse belonging to a rebel. His brother, Lieutenant Clark, escaped with a hole through his hat and a saber wound in his arm. Those who got away met that evening in Reisterstown, and when the roll was called the morning of June 30th, 28 men, 4 officers reported out of 102. 2 had been killed, 10 wounded, and the rest taken prisoners. The Delaware men had no idea what they were doing when they made their wild dash. Stuart afterwards complimented them on their pluck. Captain Corbett was paroled at Hanover the next day, but was afterwards ordered by the government to report for duty and served with the 6th Corps in Grant's final campaign. It is said, however, he always felt he had broken his word of honor by returning to the field before his parole had been released. One of the survivors of the affair at Westminster was asked today if Corbett fought well. "Did he fight well?" was the reply. "Why, damn it, he was the fight." I do have one note to add that is solely mine. In the cemetery in Westminster, Maryland, lies the grave of John William Murray, 1st Lieutenant, Company E, 4th Virginia Cavalry. He was killed during Corbett's charge. The letter placed on his grave was left by someone calling themselves a proud descendant of a Confederate veteran. I cannot speak to why Lieutenant Murray joined the Confederate Army and ultimately gave his life. But a few feet away lies the grave of Corporal Samuel Butler of Company C, 32nd Infantry, United States Colored Troops. Unequivocally, I can say he fought to free those held in bondage across the southern states. I want to thank everybody for listening to Part 2 of What They Saw, detailing Corbett's charge at the Battle of Westminster, July 29th, 1863.